The last decade has been an era of resistance. Everywhere you look, people are highlighting injustices, and everywhere you look, other people are standing up to fight against them. And yet, when it comes to the book industry, I find that many assumptions go unchecked, even when they have major implications for authors and readers. And that's why today, I want to talk about resistance when it comes to the traditional publishing industry. Stay tuned. If you've been working on your memoir for a while, but you're not making the progress you want to make, I want to offer you something really practical. The Memoir Method Checklist is going to lay out every single step in the process from idea to finished book. And I know what you're thinking, a checklist? But truly, if you don't know what you're supposed to be doing next, there is very little chance you're going to actually do it. So this checklist will guide your way through not only making a plan, but then executing the plan all the way through holding that book in your hands. You can download it for free at pageandpodium.com/checklist. I suspect that most of the people who regularly watch this channel, read our blog, listen to our podcast, are very committed to the ideas of equity and justice. That's at least what I typically see from folks that come to me after having watched this channel. But this does get to be a little bit hairy when we think about resistance to some of the inequitable structures of the traditional book industry. Because the other thing that tends to be true about the authors I work with is that they have very high standards, they want a very high quality book, and that very often means that they have their eye on a big book deal. Now, what this means is that they are now in this position both to need the support, need the approval of the traditional publishing gatekeepers, while also trying to hold on to these deeply felt, genuine beliefs that equity and justice are important, while knowing that traditional publishers are not known as the most equitable, just types of companies. So how do we reconcile this idea, this kind of love-hate that we have? Both the idea that it would feel so good to be able to have entry into the traditional book industry via a book contract, but that we also know that we don't personally support a lot of the policies, a lot of the ways that these companies approach the world. How do we balance these two ideas? Well, as a former social movement historian, as well as someone who is the owner of a hybrid press and an author services company that helps people get these big book deals, I'm in an interesting position here because I both can see that there is always a history of social movements, that there is always nuance, that there are always push-pull, there's always some level of uncertainty of how we want to approach our resistance. And I also can see how deeply felt the belief in the traditional excellence is when it comes specifically to the book industry. And that's why today I want to spend some time breaking down how we can really think about resistance to some of these structures that we find really unjust in the traditional book industry, while also not abandoning our desire to technically be part of that industry by publishing our own excellent book. Now, I want to be really clear here. I have no ulterior motives here in terms of getting you to not go for a traditional deal or getting you to self-publish or choose a hybrid. No ulterior motives. The only thing that I want to do here is give you some frameworks so that you can think about where you want to place yourself in this idea of resistance. Because I think it is really important that we can feel really good about moving forward the way that we want to. And because I often find that when we think about where we want to fall in resistance, it actually frees us up to make decisions that are truer to ourselves about where we're going to place our own book and how we're going to support other authors' books. There is lots of room, tons of gray area here, and that's what I want to get into today. So to kick this off, I first want to talk about the major term that I'm pulling up here, and that is gatekeeping. Now, when I talk about gatekeeping, I'm just simply talking about there being one entity, one kind of organization or one group of organizations that is making the decisions about who is allowed to enter and who is not. Now, this is the most kind of obvious literal interpretation of gatekeeping, right? The idea that there is a gate, someone is keeping that gate, and they will only let some people in and not others. Now, when I say it like that, it is obvious how the inequity gets into a system like that. Whenever we have one kind of closed, usually kind of monolithic, and certainly that's true in the book industry, group of people who is making all of the decisions for entry or rejection, that is always going to be a recipe for a judgment based on type. And often this is based on type of person, right? This is what we have seen throughout the book industry history, that certainly there are certain types of authors who are welcomed much more readily than other types of authors. Of course, this also can apply to types of books, and oftentimes the ideas that have been the most revolutionary, the most resistant, have been gatekept out of traditional publishing and rather been forced to find some other way to distribute without this major operating machinery of traditional publishing and distribution. Now, as I was giving this definition of gatekeeping, I did try to keep it in a really traditional viewpoint because, as I've kind of teased, there is history here, and it really matters when we think about how publishing resistance might show up now. Now, when we think about this old school way of thinking of gatekeeping, where it is one kind of monolithic group of people deciding who gets in and who doesn't get in, that is something that has been disrupted, and not recently. In fact, if we go back 75, 100 years, we already have started to see the seeds of structural resistance. And what I mean by structural resistance is recognizing that the traditional book industry does have some impressive machinery, systems, aesthetic standards, all of this stuff for producing books that we think of as excellent. And if we are going to resist, we need to be able to match at least some of what is speaking to the audience for this industry, right? We have to be able to, if not replicate, certainly we don't want to replicate the unjust parts, but we do want to be able to replicate and iterate in a way that's going to allow us to still use these same tools, but to serve the audience, to serve the authors that we want them to serve. If you think back 75, 100 years, this was actually pretty difficult. Now, in the year of our Lord 2026, all of us can self-publish very, very easily through platforms like Kindle Direct Publishing, KDP, Ingram Spark. But at the time, when we're thinking of the 1950s, 1970s even, what we're actually looking at is brick and mortar book publishing houses that were competing with the traditional houses. And the way that they were doing that was through one simple factor, and that is investment. Now, I've talked a lot about the different types of publishing on this channel before. You can look back if that's something that is particularly interesting to you. We talk about that all the time, and you can always filter for the topics you're looking for at pageandpodium.com/blog. You'll see we've got topics: development, writing, drafting, revising, and marketing and publishing. So head over there, choose publishing. You'll be able to see that I've broken this down a lot in different videos over the years. But for now, suffice it to say that the thing that differentiates the traditional publishers from some of these resistant organizations that rose up in the mid-20th century is that the traditionals are always going to be the ones that make the financial investment. With traditional publishing, you, the author, are submitting your book, your manuscript, for consideration to an acquisitions editor. That acquisitions editor is the first gatekeeper, unless, of course, we're talking about agents who we need to get into acquisition editors with some of the major houses. And they are the people, truly, that have the power to determine whether your book is going to move forward or not. Now, if they choose it to move forward, that is very, very special, as the authors that I talk to always recognize. Because what that means is one of these traditional publishing houses is going to actually pay. Now, in the traditional time, 100 years ago, you would pretty much always expect an advance. Now, that is short for advance on royalties, and what that means is there is a check that your publisher would give you up front that would be in advance of the royalties. The idea is they will give you this chunk of money. You write the book at that time. You write the book, finish it, give it to them, they sell it. And as they are earning back their money, they are actually earning back the money they already paid you in advance, hence an advance. Now, the big difference here is that traditionals are fronting all of the financial investment up front. They have built the systems, they have built the machinery, sometimes literal, sometimes more figurative. They are using that to produce your book. That's of course not free. And so by them fronting that expense, they are pulling your book into their system. Now, for the record, I do often find this sounds a lot more rosy than it really is in real life. Nowadays, particularly, if you get an advance, they're often not nearly as big as they were at one time, and most authors will never see another penny beyond that advance. That just is the way it goes. Typically, you're going to get some kind of a return in the range of 2.5% on the net. So that is a really small percentage for the author to get. Now, in contrast, these resistant presses that started to spring up in the mid-20th century said, we have all the same machinery, we have all the same systems, we can produce a book that looks identical to what the traditionals are doing. But because we are not going to be so gatekeepy, we are going to let more people in, that actually means that we need some financial investment to keep our machinery running. Now, this makes perfect sense, and I think in any other industry, we would wonder why that hadn't happened before. But in this case, as this resistant type of press started to rise up, started to say, you know what, we want to work with you in the same way the traditionals do. We have the same type of investment in terms of quality, in terms of production, but we need you to invest some of the cash flow so that we can get things started. Well, what did the traditionals say when they saw that? Of course, what they are going to see there is a threat. When they are the only ones that are able to publish your book, well, they have the pick of the litter, right? They get to pick of all the possible books, which ones they want, which ones they don't, and that is the final word. Well, what happens as these resistant presses start to show up and take some of the books that they would have liked to acquire? Well, they didn't like it. And just like in every other industry that has ever been disrupted in the entire history of everything, the traditionals were mad. They labeled these more resistant presses vanity presses. And here is where we land at my first point, which is a two-parter. I want to say a couple things about vanity presses here. The first being, I cannot imagine, and I wonder whether you can either, why we would think of it as vanity to feel like you want to get your story out without having to tailor it to the expectations of gatekeepers who have traditionally not used the most equitable ways of looking at books. Why is that vanity? Why is it vanity to have control over your story? Why is it vanity to say, this deserves to be out there whether you think so or not? Why is that vanity? Well, the second thing I want to say about this is that there's a very specific reason that these traditional presses chose to label these presses as vanity presses. And the reason is, it's not the vanity of the press, it's the vanity of you, the author. Well, that's a powerful argument to make, right? If we start to think about going to these presses as just a matter of our personal author's vanity, well, who could justify that, right? Who's going to step forward and say, oh yeah, I went to one of these presses just because I'm vain? Y'all, this is a very specific rhetorical strategy on the parts of the traditionals. They could have called these companies scam companies. They could have called them pop publishing or something else that makes it seem kind of silly and light. They didn't call it those things because those things don't describe you, the author. They describe this alternative industry. Instead, they chose Vanity Press to make you feel bad for thinking there was any alternative to going with them. Y'all, can you hear how fired up I get about this? There is no term in publishing that makes me more angry than the idea of a vanity press, because even today, even 100 years later, I still, every single day, see authors getting shamed for investing in their book financially rather than crossing their fingers, hoping and dreaming that they would maybe have a shot at getting through these very unjust, very inequitable gates. Y'all, we're not going to do it anymore. Not in this era of resistance, because the way that gatekeeping works is the same way that every other injustice throughout time has worked. It's a two-part thing. First, you make the access to the thing very, very difficult. And second, You convince the people who need access that it's their own fault they can't get through. Oh, it makes me so angry, y'all. Now, one of the ways that this specifically happened when it comes to the literary industry is that rather than just simply saying, you know what, it's our way or the highway, you need to do this and this and this and this, and then we'll let you in. What often happened and continues to happen with the traditional book industry is there is no clear way for you to actually meet the criteria that they might have. And the reason is they don't really have criteria. When we are thinking about the traditional book industry, I find that most people assume that the criteria for entry is just excellence. It's just quality. But that is intentional, y'all, because what does that even mean? If we say, okay, well, your book needs to be high quality, well, I can tell you, I have seen many very high quality books that had queried and queried and queried for years, and then just decided, you know what, it's not worth it. Sometimes those folks self-publish, by the way, and do so well. Sometimes those folks self-publish or they work with a hybrid and their book gets excellent distribution. It gets excellent reviews from the actual readers, the actual people that the author care about, much more, I hope, than the traditional book industry. And so we know that quality is not actually the thing. Does quality matter? Of course, quality matters, of course. Any good publisher, traditional, hybrid, whatever it might be, is not going to accept a low quality book. My point is that quality is not enough. Quality itself is not a lever that lets you through the gate. Rather, there are multiple factors that change all the time. One that we point to often, because this is true and increasingly true in nonfiction, by the way, is that your platform can often be a criteria that you need to meet to be able to get through the gates of the traditionals. This makes sense. The traditionals are investing financially because they want to see that your book makes them a return. In other words, they will give you money for that book manuscript, but only if they are certain that that book manuscript is going to give them money once they publish it. Well, fair enough, right? Except when we think about that line as a criteria, it doesn't change when you're talking about the traditionals versus the more resistant types of presses, right? When we're thinking about, is that author going to be able to sell copies? That is dependent in any case on the author's relationship with audience, particularly now that we have social media, but social media is not the only entry here, by the way. There is a major pressure for authors to be reaching their audiences directly, to actually be speaking to those audiences. So of course that's what the traditionals want, but it's what you should want too as an author. It's what every book actually needs. So that's not really a criteria either when we think about that, right? So quality, not really. Platform, yes, but for any type of publishing that's important. And often when we start digging into, well, what are the actual criteria? Y'all, some of them are so dumb, and I'm just gonna give you one right here and leave it at that. Many fiction agents will filter your query depending on what day of the week you sent it. Yes, there are agents out there that say, if your query was sent on a day other than a Tuesday or Thursday, I will not look at that. Well, y'all, that's not about quality. That's certainly not about platform. If we're gonna be setting rules like that, I really have to ask, are these really the types of entries that we even want? If that's the type of thing that's judging whether or not we get in, I don't know. Give me a break. And basically, when we look at all of this, what we can see is that there really are two ways that gatekeeping functions. First, it functions at the actual industry level, the actual people who are standing at the gate and deciding who gets to come in and who doesn't get to come in. But the hidden part of this equation is that the author is part of this too. If we didn't believe it was worth getting through that gate, we wouldn't give them the power to let people in or not. We wouldn't even care who they let in or not. But we, the author, we readers, we editorial individuals, we author services companies, we invest that support, that love, that admiration, that honor onto the traditionals. And that is actually what props up their ability to stand at the gate and let people in or not. They couldn't just declare it if we didn't invest in it too, which, by the way, is true of almost every power structure out there. Okay, so that said, knowing then that we've got two routes by which this gatekeeping works, we also have two routes by which we can resist. That is always the model, by the way. So let's break this down. And I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about how some of us at the industry level are and can continue to resist some of these gatekeeping structures. But I want to spend the majority of the rest of this video talking through some of the ways that you can practically resist. So let's start with just a little chat about how the industry can approach this, because this is something that I'm really proud of with Page and Podium. Now, I am somebody who has traditionally published. I have 3 traditionally published books with 3 different presses, and I also have worked with many, many authors who had gotten traditional book contracts, who have published their books traditionally, both at small presses and at large presses. So I am not somebody who is separate from the traditionals, and I want to be really clear about that, because certainly a lot of the power, a lot of the influence I have been able to have in this space has been because I have been through this traditional process. So I want to be really open about that is part of how I'm seeing this. But one of the things that I really realized, the longer I have been in this industry and the longer specifically that I have been working with authors directly, the more that I have seen that there are things we can take out of the traditional press that don't have anything to do with the structures of inequity and injustice. Things like, are we moving through flows that really prioritize the author's vision and voice? Are we thinking about reader needs and how the choices that we're making as authors and editorial staff are or are not serving what the reader wants and needs? Are we thinking about which aspects of stories need to be brought to light, not only to resonate, but to do the things we want them to do in the world? Well, all of these things are tools that we really are borrowing from the way the traditionals have operated all along. But we don't have to use them in the way the traditionals do. And so I like to think of Page and Podium's role, and I'm working always to refine this and make sure that it speaks as much as possible to our readers and our authors. I try to really think about not being gatekeeping, not standing at the gate, but rather guiding folks through. Now, we can make an argument about whether you even want to be behind the gate, and I will never argue if you decide you want to go totally out there. But the way that I like to think about this is that many, many authors and many readers have really become accustomed to a book that looks and feels the way the traditionals established it should look and feel. Now, we can fight against that if we want to, and again, do that if you are so called. But I find that a lot of authors, the thing they actually want isn't necessarily entry into the gate-kept area of the traditionals. What they want is a quality that looks like that. What they want is a book that comes out looking legitimate, looking like it did actually get through that gate. Now, this is a fine line, and there's some gray area, some fuzzy stuff here that we really have to work through on our own, decide how we as authors, we as editors, we as owners feel about some of these industry things. But I am personally of the mind that there is nothing inherently harmful about excellent editorial, about excellent design, about beautiful aesthetics. There is certainly nothing wrong about grabbing your reader and pulling them into the things that you want to share. So let's do those things. Let's get rid of the inequity and the injustice by making this accessible while also keeping the things that we want access to intact. So I share this because I do believe that we can move forward without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We can keep the things that we enjoy and prioritize and find really valuable. And that's what I want to do. That's what I want to do as the owner of a hybrid press. That's what I want to encourage authors to do, whether or not they choose to go the traditional route. And that is what I want to encourage through this podcast, through these videos, through our blog, because I think it's really, really important that we start to shift the reasons that we are giving particular pieces of media, particular books, particular ideas, particular messages. Why do we give them our attention? I want to shift that to excellence, to aesthetics, away from gatekeeping, away from some kind of imbued legitimacy that we are all contributing to, whether we think we are or not, just simply by looking to see whether this is a Simon & Schuster book or a self-published one. That is my mission, and that is how I feel the industry is best positioned to resist. But I want to spend a little bit more time even talking about how authors can resist. And I've got 3 ways here that are mostly just going to be about shifting your thoughts, identifying what kinds of biases you bring in, and finally just landing where you want to land in terms of these systems. Okay, so the first thing I want to ask you to do is really reflect on your own thought patterns when it comes to the idea of a traditional book contract, the traditional publishers, the big 5, however you typically tend to think of this. One thing that I find, not only in the book industry, by the way, but in basically all social movements, is that many people, it's very easy to fall into this trap of really hating these big systems, hating this injustice, unless they would please let us in. Now, I know that that is a difficult thing to hear, but this is very, very common in almost every single moment of social change historically. There always have been people who do believe that we should resist the injustice, but at the same time, they really deeply feel committed to the things that they might be able to get if the injustice would just ease up a little bit and let them in. I have sometimes heard this described as not wanting to open the door of the birdcage for everybody else, but simply wanting to slide through the bars yourself while leaving the door intact. And I think this is an exact metaphor for how the publishing industry tends to work. We are seduced by the idea of what it would mean to be an insider, and so we don't fully want to dissolve the door between insider and outsider. But y'all, we must. We must, if we are going to move the book industry forward to a more just, accessible model, we must recognize that the actual injustice is not in who gets to be in or out. The actual injustice is in a small monolithic group getting to choose the in versus the out. And the only way to change that is to take away the in versus the out. The group that gets to choose is the readers. The group that gets to choose is not the industry. So that's the first thing that I want you to think about. And I really want to acknowledge, I often can see that this is really something that almost is like a trauma bond, almost like where we've got this 2-step process where on one hand, we feel beaten down, demoralized, we're querying and not getting responses. And at the same time, we will see that other people are getting through the door. It is possible. And that sort of functions to pull us in, right? Almost like a secondhand love bomb, that it gives us just enough hope that we're willing to continue to be beaten up by this process. Once you can see that, I think it's really difficult to hold the same position. So give that a little bit of thought. I think that's the first piece of resistance, that we realize where we fit and how we fit into this larger system. The second way I want you to resist as an author is to remember that this is a historical pattern. This is something that has happened in industries throughout time. And I want to give you an example that relates to art, because I do find that art ends up being kind of a sticking point in some ways, kind of a way in for some of these injustices, because art is so special and personal and difficult to define whether or not it is quote unquote good. Now here I want to point out the work of a neo-Marxist scholar, Walter Benjamin. Now Benjamin's work is contested in some ways, and I'm actually going to poke at it a bit. Benjamin's most famous work is describing this idea of an aura. Now Benjamin is arguing that when art becomes mechanically reproduced, when we are able to, say, print 1,000 copies of a poster-sized print of the Mona Lisa, there is something that is lost in that reproduction process. And what he describes is if you were able to go to see the Mona Lisa, you would feel a kind of aura coming off of it. That is a special work. And just simply by reproducing what it looks like, we don't get that same aura. So the poster version of the Mona Lisa does not have an aura to it. And by that, he means that when we're reproducing, we have to realize something is lost between us and the work. Now, as I was coming through, a lot of my work is in audience and reception studies. And one of the things that we talked a lot about was the ways that Benjamin is right in some ways, but the ways that this is a very limiting way of looking at justice. And the reason is, when we think about the original Mona Lisa, many of us will never have the opportunity to stand in front of it and feel whatever aura that might be. So sure, maybe if we look at our poster reproduction, we don't get that same feeling. But does that mean there is nothing to appreciate about something that could be reproduced in a poster? Is there nothing to celebrate just sheerly about access. And that is the question here. Often I find that we build up in our minds the idea that a traditional publishing contract has something like an aura, something that you would not be able to replicate, not only because it's this one special thing, but also because it's kind of an imagined piece, right? What is even aura? How would we even define that? The fact that we can't convinces us that we need to keep trying for the original. But there is some freedom to realizing that you are never going to go see the Mona Lisa in person, and you might as well just buy that poster if you like it. The freedom is in the access. The fact that we have the ability to choose, and that yes, if that aura is real, we can still go for that aura. But realizing that we can still get all of the beautiful aesthetics, we can still enjoy the work. That is the key here. And I think when we start to realize that throughout history, every single point where art has changed to become more accessible, at every single point, there has been this bifurcation where we're really holding up the quote unquote real art, meaning the way it's traditionally been done, and we're really trying to tamp down this access that's coming up. Well, almost across the board, we have all realized that that was not the way eventually. We haven't gotten there quite with the traditional book industry, but we are well on our way. And I think realizing that helps take a lot of the pressure that we feel off of really trying to get that contract, really trying to see the real Mona Lisa, even when we're holding ourselves back from looking at a poster that we would really enjoy, from being able to get a lot of the aesthetics, a lot of the excellence without having to travel. Okay, the third way that I want you to think about resisting some of these issues with the traditionals is I want you to remember that the traditional industry does not always get it right. And in fact, we see examples of this almost every day. You may have read that there was a recent book that was pulled, its contract was taken away because it used AI. Now, I want to point something out here that I think is pretty key, and that is that the idea to pull the contract did not come from an editorial staff member catching AI in the manuscript. The contract was pulled because readers identified the AI. Now, we can debate whether the folks on the inside of the industry did not realize that they were reading AI. Oftentimes, industry individuals are really resistant to using AI, so are not as familiar with the kind of AI voice as readers might be. Or we could argue that the industry professionals didn't care. We can argue that in this case of this book, it already had a very solid audience out there, and they knew that there was an ROI. That's all they cared about. I don't know, and I don't even need to weigh in. The thing I want to tell you is that the industry got it wrong. They signed this book that had AI, they believed in it, they put it out there, and when readers resisted it, they retracted. That is the way the industry works. The industry wants us to believe that they shape reader opinions, but the opposite is actually true. The industry is almost across the board reacting to what they have seen audiences like before. And that's why they get it wrong when things start to change, as they are now, as they have been. Another example that I want to share that I think pulls this resistance factor in is when we think about the summer of 2020. Now, I have a book on this. This is a time period that I studied deeply, particularly in terms of the way that ordinary people were resisting following the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, all of these horrific things that were happening at the time and had been happening without that same level of attention. Now, around this time, you may remember there was a big push where lots of industries, lots of corporations, educational organizations all felt a lot of pressure to put out statements on how they were thinking about racial equity. Now, this is a good thing because companies should be reckoning with racial equity. But one of the choices the book industry made was to think about how they were promoting various authors. And what they felt pressured to do, I think this is, by the way, a very good thing, is they felt pressured to bring on more Black voices, more Black stories. But we might ask, why just now? 2020 was not even the beginning of the Black Lives Matter era, let alone the beginning of racial justice. Why did we not already have a push for more Black voices and more Black stories? Well, the reason, as many of my industry reception scholar friends have noted for years and years, is that the industry would tell people white people won't read Black books and there aren't enough Black readers to support Black authors. They said that, y'all, with a straight face. They believed that to be true. Now, why did they believe that to be true? Because if you are not putting out Black stories by Black authors, you have no idea who will buy them. And that was the case for the industry. Well, wouldn't you know it? Once they started putting out more Black authors, they found that there were a lot of people that wanted to read these stories. There were a lot of people, Black and not, who were really interested in what these authors had to say. But the industry had been resisting it because they were working on the old notion that Black stories can only be marketed toward Black readers. And, by the way, this is quite racist, that Black readers were not going to read in enough numbers to support the industry turning that direction. It's horrific. And yet, they had stood behind it, and in many cases continue to stand behind it, by the way, for years and years and years. So what does this mean for us as authors? Well, it means it is not the industry's approval we need. It is our readers' approval we need. And in fact, this is an excellent reason to break yourself away from the trads, especially if you're trying to disrupt. The trads are always going to be on the side of safety. Now, sometimes they will put out explosive books because they know they will sell, but they will not put out a book that they think will harm their reputation. They will not put out a book that they think is too extreme or radical for any readers to enjoy. And my point here is you probably know better than they do what your readers want to hear. So, that said, my third and final tip for author resistance is really think about whether you may actually be the authority. You may be the one that is in much better position to gatekeep in your particular audience, your particular topic, your particular genre than the industry is or ever was or ever will be. And if that is the case, well, why are we giving them all of our power? And with that, I want to close just by simply reminding you that I do not mean this video to discourage you. If you are someone who has a real investment, having thought through all of the pros and cons in a traditional book deal, I will never be the person to discourage you from following that. But what I do want you to do is move into that position knowing what it means contextually, knowing what it means for you as an author, knowing what it means for you as your readers, and really just understanding the push-pull that so many of us have between industries that we do find problematic, but that we still rely on, whether we need to or not. So as you're moving forward, I hope that you have found this a helpful way of thinking through things. I hope that this has given you a lot of things to consider as you're moving forward, making those decisions. And as I said earlier in this video, I also want to mention that at Page and Podium, we really see ourselves not as gatekeepers, but as guides through the gate. And I stand by that. I want to see your book. I want to talk to you about your book. I want to understand what it is you're trying to do. And if it would be helpful, I want to put my eyes and or my team's eyes on your book to help you shepherd it through that gate, to help you get it out to the people who need it without having to knock at the door and beg the gatekeepers. Your book deserves more than that. And I hope I have motivated you today, given you a little bit of insight and experience into how you can think about this from a more industry-savvy perspective. If I can help with your book, I hope you'll head over to pageandpodium.com/contact. You can book a call with me. As I said, I would love to hear more about your book. And in the meantime, happy writing. If you've been working on your memoir for a while, but you are just not making the progress you want to make, I want to offer you a super practical solution. The Memoir Method Checklist is going to walk you through every single step from idea to finished book, and not in some kind of vague, pump you up, inspirational way, but rather in a super practical, get this thing done kind of way. You can download it for free at pageandpodium.com/checklist.